안녕하세요. 오늘은 찰리와초콜릿공장의 비밀 제24장 Veruca in the Nut Room을 낭독해 보도록 하겠습니다. Mr. Wonka rushed on down the corridor. The nut room is sat on the next door they came to. All right, said Mr. Wonka. Stop here for a moment and catch your breath and take a peek through the glass panel of this door. But don't go in. Whatever you do, don't go into the nut room. If you go in, you will disturb the squatters. Everyone crowded around the door. Oh, look, Grandpa, look, cried Charlie. Squatters, shouted Veruca Salt. Jeepers, said Mike TV. It was an amazing sight. 100 squatters were seated upon high stools around a large table. On the table there were mound and mound of walnut, and the squatters were all working away like mad, shelling the walnut at a tremendous speed. These squatters are specially trained for getting the nut out of walnut, Mr. Wonka explained. Why use squatter? Mike TV asked. Why not use Oompa Loompas? Because, said Mr. Wonka, Oompa Loompa can't get walnut out of walnut shell in one piece. They always break them in two. Nobody except the squatter can get walnut whole out of walnut shells every time. It is extremely difficult, but in my factory, I insist upon using only whole walnut. Therefore, I have to have a squatter to do the job. Aren't they wonderful? The way that get those nuts out, and see how they first tap each walnut with their knuckles to be sure it's not a bad one. If it's bad, it makes a hollow sound, and they don't bother to open it. They just threw it down the garbage chute. There, look, what's that squatter nearest to us? I think he's got a bad one now. They watched the little squatter as he tapped the walnut shell with his knuckle. He cocked his head to one side, listening intently. They suddenly threw the nut over his shoulder into a large hole in the floor. Hey, Mommy, shouted Veruca Salt suddenly. I've decided I want a squatter. Get me one of those squatters. Don't be silly, sweetheart, said Mrs. Salt. These all belong to Mr. Wonka. I don't care about that, shouted Veruca. I want one. All I've got at home is 2 dogs and 4 cats and 6 bunny rabbits and 2 parakeets and 3 canaries and a green parrot and a turtle and a bowl of goldfish and a cage of white mice and a silly old hamster. I want a squatter. All right, my pet, Mrs. Salt said smoothly. Mommy'll get you a squatter just as soon as she possibly can. But I don't want any old squatter, Veruca shouted. I want a trained squatter. At this point, Mr. Salt, Veruca's father, stepped forward. Very well, Wonka, he said importantly, taking out a wallet full of money. How much do you want for one of these crazy squatters? Name your price. There's not for sale, Mr. Wonka answered. She can't have one. Who says I can't? Shouted Veruca. I'm going in to grab me a squatter this very minute. Don't, said Mr. Wonka quickly. But it was too late. The girl had already thrown open the door and rushed in. The moment she entered the room, 100 squatters stopped what they were doing and turned their head and stared at her with a small black batty eye. Veruca Salt stopped also and stared back at them. Then her gaze fell upon a pretty little squatter sitting nearest to her at the end of the table. The squatter was holding a wallet in its paws. All right, Veruca said, I'll have you. She reached out her hand to grab the squatter, but as she did so, in that first split a second when her hand started to go forward, there was a sudden flash of the movement in the room, like a flash on the brown lightning, and every single squatter around the table took a flying leap toward her and landed on her body. 25 of them caught hold of her right arm and pinned it down. 25 more caught hold of her left arm and pinned it down. 25 caught hold of her right leg and anchored it to the ground. 24 caught hold of her left leg, and the one remaining squatter climbed up on her shoulder and started tapping the wretched girl's head with his knuckles. Save her, screamed Mrs. Salt. Veruca, come back. What are they doing to her? They are testing her to see if she's a bad nut, said Mr. Wonka. You watch. Veruca struggled furiously, but the squatter held her tight and she couldn't move. The scooter on her shoulder went tap-tap-tapping the side of her head with his knuckles. Then, all at once, the squatter pulled Veruca to the ground and started carrying her across the floor. My goodness, she is a bad nut after all, said Mr. Wonka. Her head must have sounded quite hollow. Veruca kicked and screamed, but it was no use. The tiny strong paws held her tightly and she couldn't escape. Where are they taking her? Shrieked Mr. Salt. She's going where all the other bad nut goes, and Mrs. Willy Wonka down the garbage chute. By golly, she's going down the chute, said Mr. Salt, staring through the glass door at his daughter. Then save her, cried Mrs. Salt. Too late, said Mr. Wonka. She's gone. And indeed she had. But where? Shrieked Mrs. Salt, flapping her arms. What happened to the bad nut? Where does the chute go to? The particular chute, Mr. Wonka told her, runs directly into the great big main garbage pipe which carries away all the rubbish from every part of the factory, all the floor sweepings and potato peelings and rotten cabbages and fish head and stuff like that. Who eats fish and cabbage and potatoes in this factory, I'd like to know, said Mike TV. I do, of course, answered Mr. Wonka. You don't think I live on cacao beans, do you? But, shrieked Mrs. Salt, where does the great big pipe go to in the end? Why, to the furnace, of course, Mr. Wonka said calmly, to the incinerator. Mrs. Salt opened her huge red mouth and started to scream. Don't worry, said Mr. Wonka. There's always a chance that they've decided not to light it today. A chance, yelled Mrs. Salt. My darling Veruca, she'll be sizzled like a sausage. Quite like, my dear, said Mr. Salt. Now see here, Wonka, he added. I think you've gone just a shade too far this time. I do indeed. My daughter may be a bit of a plump. I don't mind admitting it, but that doesn't mean you can roast her to the crisp. I'll have you know I'm extremely cross about this. I really am. Oh, don't be cross, my dear sir, said Mr. Wonka. I expect she'll turn up again sooner or later. She may not even have gone down at all. She may be stuck in the chute just below the entrance hall, and if that's the case, and you will have to do is go in and pull her up again. Hearing this, both Mr. and Mrs. Salt dashed into the nut room and ran over to the hole in the floor and peered in. Veruca, shouted Mrs. Salt, are you down there? There was no answer. Mrs. Salt bent further toward to get a closer look. She was now kneeling right on the edge of the hole with her head down and her enormous behind sticking up in the air like a giant mushroom. It was a dangerous position to be in. She needed only one tiny little push, one gentle nudge in the right place, and that is exactly what the squatters gave her. Over she toppled into the hole head first, screeching like a parrot. Good gracious me, said Mrs. Salt, as he watched his fat wife tumbling down the hole. What a lot of garbage there's going to be today. He saw her disappearing into the darkness. What's it like down there, and Regina? He called out. He leaned further forward. The squatters rushed up behind him. Help! He shouted, but he was already toppling forward, and down the chute he went, just as his wife had gone before him and his daughter. Oh dear, cried Charlie, who was watching with the others through the door. What on earth's going to happen to them now? I expect someone will catch them at the bottom of the chute, said Mr. Wonka. But what about the great fairy incinerator? Asked Charlie. They only like it every other day, said Mrs. Wonka. Perhaps this is one of the days when they let it go out. You never know. They might be lucky. Shh, said Grandpa Joe. Listen, here comes another song. From far away down the corridor came the beating of the drums. Then the singing began. 들어주셔서 감사합니다.